everybody, and welcome to another live stream for a Wicked Parlay. I'm your co-host, Rose, and this is your main host, Justin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to our first episode of Back to Basics. This is a series is about providing a mighty, brief, and slightly awesome overview of fundamental topics in order to create a solid foundation for future episodes and live streams. If you want to talk about any of these topics in further detail, feel free to message the show. Use the email, Twitter, Discord, or any of our other socials. And for God's sakes, don't find our real socials. Don't do it. Anyways, today's episode will be briefly looking at 5 concepts. These 5 concepts cover things like the thought process behind Freudian thinking, also Skinner and some of his behavioral models, Piaget's ideas about development and some of his cognitive theories, as well as psychological research, how it's conducted, how it's collected, and finally treatment ideology. So, who's excited to talk about this one? I mean, honestly, isn't this an episode that everyone was waiting for?
Hi. Alright. So, first order of business. Basic concepts around Freudian thoughts. What do you want to mention first?
Well, I suppose the thing I'd want to mention first is the unconscious mind. I mean, honestly, there are a variety of things that could be said about Sigmund Freud, but I think his ideas around the unconscious mind is probably some of the more intriguing things, and of the very limited factual-based stuff that could probably be held up as pseudo-credible today.
Pseudo-credible, huh?
Pseudo-credible, yeah, I would say so.
Like what?
Primarily, I would say the ideas behind the id, the ego, and the superego are very likely to have some sort of root in reality, whether they are exactly as discussed by Freud or some weird formulation of them. It's probably steeped in some form of reality. But I think there's probably a lot more than just the psychodynamic principles at play when talking about those particular things. So.
Okay. So you mentioned id, ego, superego. I've heard of those in my high school education. Probably some other people have also heard about it too. But I always confuse them once every couple of months. It's just So, could you describe them in more detail?
Yeah, I could do it a little bit of detail, but also if you throw up the picture, the iceberg analogy is a great way of kind of looking at the ego, the superego, and the id. You can think of the ego kind of like your conscious mind. It's the part of your mind that like, okay, hey, when you're not talking out loud, but there are words going on in your head, you're probably going, yeah, there's probably something there. And this is kind of like where it's like, oh, I need to go get groceries, go brush my teeth, comb my hair, which I need to do, and other things like that are typically considered, your sort of rational or habitual type of thinking. Then there's the preconscious level, or superego, and you can kind of think of this as kind of like a gray area between what you're consciously aware of and what would be like your darker, deeper impulses. And this is kind of where your ideas of being like, let's say you go to the gym, you're like, I'm going to be buff someday, or I'm going to be the best student I possibly can be, or like if you're like a parent or something like that, as the thing actually says, now I see that, it kind of is a way of becoming a better, more fulfilled version of yourself. It's kind of like your idealistic self. Also, you could kind of consider it as like your Jiminy Cricket. And then there's the unconscious or subconscious, depending upon who you ask, which is the id. And this is basically all the stuff that is bad, that you're like constantly told, don't do this. This is terrible. This is really awful. This is where like your like sexual impulses of just like if you're a guy or a girl, or like, choose your gender, and you see someone who you're like, I want to fuck that person. They're like, I'm just gonna rip their clothes off in the middle of the street, just go to town. It's like, yeah, that's your impulses. That's not like at all this, and that's what's supposed to be the id, or the aggression, which you could look at that situation as, yes, that's aggression of sorts.
That's pretty aggressive, yeah.
That's fairly aggressive, I would say. As well as other irrational ideas. Also, Freud kind of talks about dreams, and the subconscious or unconscious level, in this particular example, is critical to explaining some of the things that go on in some of his ideas surrounding dreams, primarily the idea that dreams are just ways the mind is able to facilitate those baser impulses. Because it's believed that if you don't allow yourself to process those impulses, that it will drive you crazy. Who's to say who's right or wrong on that? But at least that's what the gist behind some of the things that he said.
All right. Thank you very much for the explanation. So, what psychological methods have actually used this information to help people?
Okay. All right. So once again, I really don't like giving credit to Freud when it comes to anything, but he is recognized as one of the fathers of essentially talk therapy, and it's something that the world has recognized in the last 100, 120 years or so as something that's actually very helpful to people. Being able to just share your thoughts and ideas and opinions and find ways of managing pressures that are experienced overall your whole life is typically seen as a valuable thing. And so definitely you could say that he led or pioneered or championed, choose your vernacular, when it comes to that. And I don't know, I just hate the whole concept of some of the things that are surrounding Freud. I just gotta say that. It makes me mad. I want this to be said, because I think it's important. Freud is a guy who came into an academic situation at probably just the perfect time, right? And was just influential enough to be able to get access to other people's work, and then he would build off of their work, and then he would get all the credit. And while he did come up with some concepts that were kind of original, the core of them more often than not usually belonged to somebody else. And so if you ever were like, hey, I wonder what he really did, you could go on Wikipedia and just click on the links, and you'll find hyperlinks to other people whom are connected to his work. And if you actually research the work in which they were working on and find out, oh, suddenly they stopped working on it because Freud joined, or Freud added to the research and suddenly it became Freud's idea. It's like, that happened a lot.
Oh.
A lot. And this is actually right here. That's probably not supposed to be there. So professional. So professional. Anyway.
Okay, so you've mentioned a couple of projects that he essentially joined and took over.
Mm-hmm.
So for psychology today, what psychological improvements have been made in the field to actually support some of his thoughts and opinions, if any?
Well, I think it's kind of whether or not it's 100% accurate or not, it has been socially accepted that there is this idea of the subconscious mind. And I think that plays a huge role in our acceptance of certain elements of mental health. You could definitely say that because of the prevalence of talk therapy, a lot of people who would normally have undiagnosed treatments that are more severe now have an opportunity to get diagnosed, although diagnoses are still out there in large numbers that haven't been calculated, so working on that hopefully, but it's put us in the right direction. I think the biggest thing though, like if anything, is that he created such a controversial topic that it's still talked about today. And anything that's controversial and is allowed to still be talked about adds value, because even if you're wrong, you're getting people to think. And that in itself is amazing and important. It's one of the reasons why I hate cancel culture, because even if you don't like something, you should be able to share that value, and people should learn from that difference of opinion, even if you don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm. Fair. Well, alright then. I think that's enough about Freud for one night.
Too much. There's a few other things I want to talk about when it comes to Freud.
Oh yeah? Go ahead.
It's very important. So, I'm not just picking on Freud because no reason. I mean, let's just put it this way. Freud did so much cocaine.
What?
Yeah, cocaine, like the drug cocaine.
Yeah.
That he would sometimes write in drug-filled rages, papers and other things, and try and get them submitted, and people would just turn them away and dismiss. Also, Freud was heavily influenced by the writings of William Shakespeare, and it has a lot to do with some of the like Oedipus complexes and things like that are discussed that are extremely controversial. And so, like, I think it's important to understand that just because someone does something good, it doesn't mean that they're perfect, and there's a lot of bad shit typically tied to those people, especially the further back you go.
Oh, goodness.
And I could talk a lot about Freud, a lot. So if people want to hear me talk more about Freud, I'd be happy to shit on him for an hour. Best
we
hour
do.
spent.
Yeah, we also do agree with the Kyle. Freud was important because he was so wrong. Proving him wrong has advanced the field, as mentioned before.
Yes, Kyle, that is exactly correct. That's the reason why I said what I said. Okay.
All right, enough about Freud.
Indeed. All right, now
All
we're
right.
going to talk about somebody that I'll be honest. If I met this guy, we would not be friends. But I respect his work much more than I respect Freud, and that is Skinner. B.F. Skinner. He is kind of like the champion of the behavioral models. And one of the things that's important to understand about Skinner primarily is the fact that he kind of believed that free will was an illusion. He kind of believed that when you were born, the process of being born essentially was a condition that you then responded to, and that everything that you experience after that point is just a stimulus or something in your environment that you react to, and as a consequence you have no control over the things in which you get exposed to, and therefore you have no free will. It's kind of more complex than that, but I'm really simplifying it because that's what this is all about. But if people want to know more about that particular part of some of Skinner's ideology, I'd be happy to go into it in a later episode or a private email or on our Patreon, which I will respond to directly to a personal video, whomever asks me questions on Patreon. So know that's there. Cocaine. Yeah, seriously, Freud. Man, I'm going to do it. Anyways, so back to Skinner. When it comes to some of this stuff, honestly, he revolutionized one of the main aspects of how we perceive human nature, and was able to legitimize in a scientific way psychology in a way that it hadn't really been viewed before. It's kind of important to understand that psychology for a really long time was struggling to be considered a science. Some people viewed psychology as a soft science or as pseudoscience because many of the things in which were discussed in psychology were kind of borrowed from other fields. When it comes to, like, say, biology, or when it comes to certain other smaller things. And it just was having a real tough time. And so it was very difficult to get data that actually supported theories and built the field to what it kind of is today. And so Skinner was able to, with his behavioral models, show certain examples that could be measured and could be experimented on and could be repeated. And this legitimized, in a significant way, the entire field. And we kind of owe a big debt to that particular line of work, so that way it could be the wonderful field that it is today. Skinner was by no means perfect when it came to things. There are plenty of things that are errors, but I think that his approach was steeped more in a scientific method, and that gave a lot of his work more credence and more credibility as a whole. And in my particular opinion, it made for a more interesting challenge when it comes to trying to prove him right or wrong.
Okay. So it's just a tool in the toolbox now?
Yeah, you can think of it like
behavioristic
behavioristic ideologies are like one of many tools. I mean, you have your cognitive tool, you have your behavioral tool, you have some of the different ideas surrounding sexual orientation, other studies that have been conducted, as well as developmental ideology. And all of those things kind of form a neat series of tools that allow you to approach each circumstance differently and come with a perspective that doesn't necessarily need to be, this is an absolute. However, Skinner was definitely more like, there's behavior, and behavior explains everything. And very little leeway was given. This was a time when it was like two extremes, and there was like these very few outliers, and then there was just behaviorists. And thankfully the pendulum kind of swings back and forth over the years, but during this particular time it was very much steeped in, this can be proven, this is scientifically tested, this is how we're going to do things. And it took time for the pendulum to shift away from that.
Gotcha. So, speaking of right and wrong,
Yeah.
or proving him right and wrong at least. So we've talked about psychological advancements that supported supported Freud earlier. Whoops. So which ones have actually supported Skinner in his work, since we've kind of flip-flopped and swung so often?
Well, if you want to pull up the little chart thing here, I think it's kind of important to understand that I think there's definitely a link based upon things in the environment that explain behaviors to some extent. Now, is it absolutely 100% this is the thing that governs it? No. And I initially didn't want Rose here to throw up this particular diagram because I thought that it would create a problem. And in fact, it does, but I'm going to actually explain it. So first I'm going to explain the gist behind the behavior idea. So behavioral analysis kind of has a couple different things. That one has to do with respondent behavior, the other one has to do with operant behavior. The way you could think about respondent behavior is kind of like classical conditioning, if any of you guys remember the drilling dogs, Pavlov, that kind of idea. And if you want me to go into it, once again, this is something that you're going to have to ask this thing. But I'm going to assume everyone knows this at this point because it's been done to death. But operant behavior is a little bit different. It's not really talked about too much, but it's kind of the best way to think about it is that it's exterior things in the environment that add or detract from something that's going on. And so that's one of the ways in which you can kind of think about this particular thing. Now, in this diagram, as you can see, one's talking about sensory motor repertoire, which is essentially the ability to detect things in your environment, and then it talks about emotional, motivational repertoire, or how you're going to feel about something. The issues primarily regarding these two particular points are entirely focused on the language aspect. There is a person that I would love to talk about that I cannot talk about right now because I will rant about it for way too long, that very much challenged Skinner's ideology when it came to talking about how behaviors and how language interact. And it primarily had to do with the fact that when you look at the way in which language is structured and the way in which children learn language, it's not something that is predictable. Children can learn a diverse set of languages and a diverse set of sentence structures, and that completely destroys the entire behavioral model surrounding the expression of language. And the moment that you take one piece of this particular thing away, the whole thing starts to fall apart. And so when you consider concepts of positive and negative, particularly in this particular diagram, this one's talking about emotions, but often when we're looking at particular behaviors, it's about adding and subtracting things from the environment that are adding stimuli. And so when you have a positive, you're adding something to something, and when you have a negative, it's subtracting something. And so when you think about these particular things and the way in which they're discussed, it usually creates more problems than it actually solves, and it starts becoming a complex mess. And later in Skinner's life, he tried to wrestle with this concept, but I think that honestly, it was just kind of it was like the behavioristic idea of stimuli and interacting and having some sort of like pre-interaction or some sort of automatic response was right, but there were other things involved that made it so that way it wasn't 100% that, and it kind of threw off his entire idea.
Okay.
But because it was testable, it was considered credible. So.
Okay. So I know we didn't want to do too much detail into Skinner, but would you be able to potentially address this or let them know if they would rather email the show for more details?
For which?
So Kyle has a comment. Skinner may have done more harm to society than Freud. He believed any disorders were caused by bad parenting, so if a child had autism, a genetic thing, people thought the parents were abusive. Any chance you could address that now, or will that be covered later?
Okay, so Kyle, I will email you a more detailed response if you'd like. Please just let us know in the chat that you want me to give your response to it email, but I'll respond to this particular thing briefly. I would say that yes, you are correct in the idea surrounding his viewpoints creating damage. One thing that can definitely be said about anything that hasn't been flushed out is that experimentations are going to create problems, and those problems sometimes have catastrophic responses and things, unfortunately, and that is definitely one of them. However, I think it's important to probably also understand that if that hadn't been said and that hadn't been done, then nothing would have been done to challenge that particular position, which ultimately led to the development of ABA therapies, which are instrumental in treating autistic behavior to this day. So as much as I would like to say, it was incredibly disruptive and destructive, I'm not going to say it wasn't, but I'm going to say is that if you didn't have that, then you wouldn't have the understanding that we currently have, and the way in which our society has embraced, accepted, and acknowledged the fact that individuals who suffer that way need to have treatment has grown. And actually you see people get treatment rather than being locked in an asylum for the rest of their lives, which was what happened before. And if it wasn't through these particular practices, we probably wouldn't have the understanding we do today. But I absolutely agree that yes, his ideology did lead to very destructive behaviors and definitely ruined some children's lives.
Yeah, that's information I wasn't expecting at all. But you know what? Fair. Good to cover. Good to make sure we know.
Yeah.
So, we've talked about Freud. We've talked about Skinner. The next person is one that I'm interested to know more about, based on what you've told me before.
Yes.
So, what can you tell me about Piaget and his work? We've mentioned him a couple of times in previous live streams, but is there anything that we actually haven't said about him yet?
Yeah, like a bajillion things. Piaget is he's probably my favorite historical psychological figure. I don't think of him as a psychologist. There's another term that I'm not going to even attempt to pronunciate. That essentially is a person who kind of studies everything in the world and human nature, human everything. And so, yeah. Oh my gosh. Where do I even begin when it comes to this? I guess the first thing to kind of understand about Piaget that we've kind of skimmed across, but I haven't really had too much of a chance, is that Piaget really was all about two different things. All right, he wants to get at the root of children, and particularly education, and also understanding that some of the things in which we learn are integral to our ability to progress in the future. And so morality was another concept that he really, really promoted. And so when you have two different things, right? Is there something wrong?
No, go for it.
Okay, cool. So you have morality and you have education. And he shaped everything when it came to that, in my particular opinion. He has probably one of the largest footprints in the psychology that we experience and discuss and teach today than probably any other figure in history, in my opinion. Because whether you like all the things that are done, it's very hard to dispute much of what Piaget said because of the way in which he went about it. The thing about Piaget that's important to understand is that Piaget very much was, before he was ever considered a psychologist, he was kind of more like a philosopher in some ways. He really approached things first from a logic kind of driven thing, and then looked at it and was very precise about certain aspects of behavior and cognition. And through all of that, it really developed his overall approach into how he looked at both the world and the way in which he presented his theories. And so I think that a lot of his ideas are very relatable and very understandable, and because they are so very specific, they're actually testable. He would observe children. He observed his own 3 children, and that observation led to a series of research that is currently being conducted to this day that's still steeped in that particular approach. And so it's really important to know that he just had a huge footprint when it came to everything when it comes to the developmental processes around children and adolescents and education.
Jeez, that's a lot.
Yeah, and honestly, I really would wish I could talk so much more about it, but I'm going to limit myself to just a few of the points that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, fair. Also, I think I might have found a word similar to what you were trying to look for before with the studying everything. Mm-hmm. It might be a pantomath. Pantomath.
It could be. I think the word that I was thinking started with an E.
Fair.
But it could be.
Yeah. According to the wiki, a pantomath, may be pronouncing that wrong. A pantomath is a person who wants to know or knows everything. So I'm going with the first part with wants to know everything.
Okay, perhaps. I know that he very much was trying to understand everything relating to human discovery. And the way in which the people operate and the way they think and all sorts of things. So it could be that.
Could be a specific form of it, but that was the only one I could find earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, obviously it's not just Piaget who's studying development.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, each person kind of did things in their different way. You could think of Piaget more as a cognitive researcher when it comes to the development of essentially human psyche. But I think especially looking at how children start to learn and explore their world and figuring out what works and what doesn't work when it comes to the educational process. Piaget is pretty much responsible for completely transforming the way both Europe and North America handles the education system. I mean, like it or hate it, the way in which the education system currently is, he definitely had a fingerprint in that particular type of learning. He really focused on making sure that children from a very early age were involved in getting an education. He knew that children's best chance to learn was steeped in early life, and that the older they got, the harder it would be for them to get some grounded concepts. So there was a plasticity of the brain that he was aware of, while not knowing the specific medical terms at the time, was able to latch onto from his observations, which is kind of one of the main things that we'll talk about later when it comes to how research is gathered, because observational efforts really go hand in hand with a lot of Piaget's ideas and are things that you can actually test and you can see even today.
Sounds there's quite a lot of information that we're just not covering.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, honestly, Piaget could be an entire episode all on his own. He could probably be like a series. Like it would probably be 1,000%. Like I love his work and
a look into Piaget.
Yeah, there's so much involved. So much.
All right. Goodness. So, we've taken a quick look into Piaget. We've talked about Freud, Skinner, name-dropped maybe some other famous figures in psychology and their works, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be way more in future episodes.
Episodes, yes.
So, how about we move on to something more general?
Yeah.
You mentioned psychological research just now. What can you tell me about how it's conducted? Because I'm pretty sure it's going to be quite a bit different from my own research.
Yeah, it might surprise you to find out that while there are definitely examples of research that is very different, there's also a lot of things that might be similar as well. One of the most important things to understand is that psychology is a field that is typically seen as just a therapist, a couch situation, popularized by Freud. However, that's not really the truth. In fact, there's just about every field under the sun uses psychology in one way or another. And so when it comes to the collection of data, for instance, the larger the sample size of the data that's being collected, the more accurate it is. And so you might find that when it comes to your particular research, the larger the sample size you have, probably the closer and more accurate your equations often are.
Yeah, the larger and the more random.
Yeah. And random is very critical, as we've kind of discussed before.
Oy.
Yeah. Definitely want to have that random, diverse sample size. You don't want to have, I don't know, about 100,000 college students that all have very similar backgrounds and life experiences taking a test and then assume that everyone in the world is like that.
I feel like that's coming from some type of personal experience or
Perhaps.
Something you read.
Well, I'll put it this way, okay? In most research that was conducted for, let's say, last 10 years or so, they've been changing, but pretty much from about 2010 and back, a large number, an incredibly large number of individuals that participated in research studies that required, just random people were college students. And because college students were kind of like, oh, here's $20 or here's a meal voucher or whatever, right, to participate in this small, nothing study. And to a college student, a meal is huge.
Oh, yeah.
I am a college student. I'm like, hey, I get a free meal. I'm doing it.
If you want to get to a college student, it's just free stuff.
Yeah, seriously. And so you end up having a lot of research that kind of has, it's interesting, and maybe it does support some things, and maybe some it's right, but I think some of it is skewed and some of it biased because the sample size is college students. So you're going to have a very limited a very limited pool of people with not a very diverse set of life experiences.
Fair.
And I don't think all of humanity fits in the college campuses of where this research is tested and conducted. So, I'm just going to say that, and I think that's pretty safe to say.
That would be a nightmare to try and imagine, to be honest. Just shoving the entire population into a set of college campuses.
I would be terrified. I just have instant thoughts about meat packaging farms and livestock that's like too close together. Like, feel those horrible PETA films.
Sardines in a can.
Or that. Yeah. It's just I just no.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
I'm good. I don't care what they pay me. No.
Okay. All right. So we've mentioned quite a bunch of terms and whatnot. So sample size, experimental, other research methods and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the overall goals of such research when it comes to psychology?
Oh my gosh, that depends entirely on what's being studied.
Fair.
And depending on what's being studied depends upon how the research is collected and what tests are used. So it might surprise some people to know this, but your everyday work office might hire a psychologist to get an understanding about how they can make their workers more productive, whether that be, how they understand or tackle problems, whether it be maybe they have personal life, maybe organizing where people are or where things are in an office, anything that can make a person more productive. And the way in which they'll do that is usually through first a series of just cross-examinations, maybe like a sit down where someone just kind of talks through their day so they get to know the person. Then they might measure, desk locations, water cooler locations, things like that. Then they might ask a whole bunch of questions about what their job entails and how they approach it. And from that point, they just start to collect as much information as they possibly can. And that collection of information takes the form of, questionnaires, stat charts, also whole sorts of fun little things that are extremely tedious and kind of boring to most psychology students that are like, I'll never do that, but you will.
Paperwork, all the paperwork.
Yeah, and those kind of things are typically what ends up happening in that particular setting to try and find a way to boost performance. And they'll often get pretty decent results. You could have a psychologist work on a sports team to get similar situation when it comes to an athlete's performance. I don't know how many times I've heard the story of the athlete who basically cheats on his girlfriend and leaves him, and then now he sucks as a player, and now sees a therapist who basically talks to him and is able to rationalize and get past some sort of insecurity which created that circumstance in the first place, and then now he performs better or as good as he used to. And so, that's another way in which a psychologist could play a role when it comes to things that you might not predict. So it's not just the couch necessarily, although in that situation kind of could be.
Maybe.
But there's a whole bunch of things too that are out there. People also research things, obviously, like consumer reports. So if you're gonna go shopping, or you want to go see a particular movie, they might see what kind of things people are interested in, and do research in that way. And that's definitely a questionnaire. Also, there's polls, during elections, stuff like that. There are pollers. Well, psychologists also poll people when it comes to things too that they're interested in finding out, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. Yeah, I mean, you name it. I mean, is there a particular field you're curious about knowing, and maybe I know what's in there?
Not off the top of my head, no. So I'll pick your brain later.
Okay, sounds good.
So, it sounds like the overall goal is to just understand why something's happening, why certain people are behaving certain ways,
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't sound like it's actually overall benefiting a large group of people, more
Oh no, no.
say individual companies, people, individuals, whatnot?
Oh, I think it is. I think.
Okay.
Well, all right, okay. I think benefits is the incorrect word.
Okay.
I think what's really going on when it comes to the things is it's a case by case scenario. While some do receive benefit, others are manipulated silently through a whole bunch of things. I mean, think about ads. Yeah, there's a lot of psychologists who are paid a absurd amount of money to basically tell advertisers what's going to trick the person into buying this product. And so,
Fair.
you have animal research that's conducted where they take some like samples of some new fragrance, and they see how an animal might react to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if there's positive reactions, then they might test it on a sample group of people, and then it goes from there, right? But it all starts with, what does a person like? What kind of things do they respond to the most? What's going to attract them? What's going to get them in the door? Those kind of things. And psychologists are definitely, they're a cheap date. I mean, they're like, for these kind of companies. I mean, they're like, hey, we're gonna fly you out to Fiji. We're gonna wine and dine. You tell us all the secrets of people, and then we're gonna get some people taking notes, and then we'll come contact you later with another trip if we need you for something else. I mean, it happens. Believe me, it happens. And I want to be on that. I mean, I'll be honest. If everyone else is doing it, I'm on board with that. I 100%.
Okay.
Like, I want the free trip. You hear that, Nestle? You hear that? Whoever is out there. I mean, I will clearly pour myself out for water. Imagine what else I'm willing to do.
Yeah. So that does make me think, with that whole, they just fly people out there, try to figure out what the people like, and then fly them out somewhere else. So what would we have to be wary of when it comes to the published papers and results and whatnot of these research experiments?
Okay, here's a dark truth when it comes to it.
Oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, dark truth time. I would say be skeptical of just about everything that doesn't come out of a non-profit university, like inherently, just automatically. I mean, I would say be skeptical of anything, but I would say especially non-profit work. If it's not for profit, if it's a for-profit thing, basically, be extremely skeptical, because they definitely use psychologists to push all sorts of things, whether it be fancy new medication, or whether it be a treatment diagnosis. And there's a book that I read a couple months ago that talked about a study that was done that looked at, I think it was a couple hundred Chinese clients that were dealing with bulimia. And when Western ideas were first brought over there, it didn't match with what was going on for their bulimia treatment at the time. And after a horrible incident that was popularized in the media, suddenly, because this information was already out there, people started mimicking the symptoms, and it created an explosive problem that was a pseudo-epidemic. So, I mean, there are severe consequences to some of this stuff, and it's important probably to be aware of it.
Understood. Goodness gracious. All right. I think that would lead up to the next topic, to be honest, which is, let's go ahead, treatment ideology. You mentioned that some of these psychologists are hired to essentially promote medicine and whatnot.
They can be.
So what else do we have when it comes to treatment, how people are treated, or even the promotion of certain treatments?
Okay, so before I even go into that, I just want to throw a warning out there, okay? Mm-hmm. Some of the information I'm about to say about the care system, unfortunately, starts with some pretty negative, pretty somewhat exaggerations of treatment, but they are factual in nature. There is stigma attached to disorders, and so it's kind of important to understand that while we're going to be talking about some pretty bad things in the first, I swear to you, we're not going to just totally be shitting on things, and I promise we're going to end on a positive note. So, with that being said, I'm gonna address your particular statement. Okay.
The landmine that it is.
Yeah. So, in essence, most prescriptions, most treatments, most anything are all tied to insurance and insurance companies. Now, the thing about insurance that you kind of probably, you would think is that it's there so that way people can help pay for the services. It's you pay this little bit amount of money each month, and when you unfortunately have a problem, you don't have to pay an incredibly large, exorbitant sum of money to get your treatment. Mm-hmm. Instead, you pay a small down or maybe nothing at all. Unfortunately, that's not really how insurance really works, at least in America. And that's because insurance in America is a for-profit institution. It is privatized. It is not something that is even really controlled by the government even. And so while many other countries in the world have realized, wait a minute, that's a really bad thing. We really don't want private insurance. We really want to have some control over this. America hasn't realized that this is a problem. So that's why we pay 20 to 50% or 200% sometimes on some medications more than any other part of the world. We have the most expensive medical system in the world, and it's not even the best.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, and so it's like, it's really, really bad. And so, here's the dark truth, right? Uh-huh. Let's say you're a person who is experiencing depression. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty common symptom that's experienced and is something that is often treated by a therapist. So you walk into a office and you're like, hey, I'm really feeling down, sad, and the person hears you out and realizes, yes, you have depression. Maybe it's not severe, could be mild, but it's clear you're going to need to see somebody for a couple of weeks, 5-6 sessions at least. And so that way you can kind of get a handle on it and kind of set you down the right path. Now, in some insurance companies, if they read that, I'm not going to say all, it's usually all, not to be honest, but let's be real honest. But we're going to assume there's some good ones out there that I just haven't heard of. And say that it's not all, but more often than not, you'll get turned away. Because they're going to go, those symptoms are not severe enough to warrant this particular expense, so we're just going to say, hey, you need one more visit, or maybe not even another visit at all, and you're good. So the patient would have to pay out of pocket in that circumstance, right? Now, going to a therapist, depending on who it is, maybe it's affordable, or maybe it's not. Depending upon your economic circumstance and who you see, that is entirely dependent on the situation. But what I can say is that most therapists typically charge upwards of $60 to $120 an hour.
Whoa.
So I'm not sure someone's like, you know what, I feel like shelling out $300 to $500 a month to go see someone 4 times, to talk about my issues. That's not an expense that the average person, I think, is really willing to make unless there's a serious problem, at which point the insurance should take it over. However, there are some examples of some therapists, and there are some people that I know that have showed me kind of like, hey, you could do this if you really think the person needs treatment, but they don't. They fudge the documents a little bit. They kind of doctor them up a little bit. Maybe the person, instead of saying has mild depression, says, hey, they have depression, and then they ask, oh, is it severe? You go, yeah. And so that way you get the extra treatment, even though you don't. Unfortunately, that also has adverse consequences.
Oh no.
Yeah, oh no. Unfortunately, if you do that, let's say hypothetically you have an accident and you're in a different part of the country, or you basically are far enough for the medical records to be the only thing they see, well, guess what appears in your medical records more often than not? You have depression. And they don't know if you're taking medication for that, and because of that, there may, not always, but there could be an example where they don't administer a certain amount of medication to you, or maybe they give you too much, assuming there's a medication in your system because of that particular treatment. And that could have adverse effects on your life. And so, as much as I would say doctoring something, depending upon what it is, depends upon if I'm willing to do it. Now, if it's anxiety or depression, Perhaps. If it were for me, perhaps. Not saying I would, but I'm not saying no either. Because it's a case-by-case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if it's something stupid like insurance isn't willing to treat somebody and they can't afford to see me. And if they saw me, then they will get help, and then they wouldn't have to, have a big problem, which might turn into something huge later that's going to be very disruptive. So I'm very much a believer of let's nip this in the bud now. That way we don't have to worry about it later, instead of letting it fester into something else.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other problems with this, of course. So in addition to having that particular problem with the insurance, there's also this other thing that happens, and it happens more often than not to psychiatrists, who are the ones who are able to actually prescribe medication. See, a therapist isn't somebody who's able to actually prescribe medication. They just recommend medication, and based on the recommendation, a doctor or a psychiatrist will then either issue it out, things like that. If it goes to a doctor and a therapist sends it, more often than not, the doctor will sign off unless there's a medical problem. But for the most part, you typically run into the pill pushing thing, which I really don't like. There is this thing that gets sometimes that you get sponsored to do, that if you're a therapist or a psychiatrist, you're like someone will fly you out somewhere and they'll tell you about this great new drug, and then they'll tell you, hey, we'll give you this type of trip free or some sort of perk if you prescribe this medication. And so they try to monetarily, twist the hand, if you will, of some people to try and push their drugs unnecessarily into some populations. And that has had catastrophic problems.
Gosh.
I don't want to get into the specifics because I don't know what the copyright situation is if I say certain medical names, but let's say that there's a Z pill it was very popular in the early 2000s that perhaps aided with anxiety and depression, has an ANK involved in it perhaps, that maybe it was helpful to some, maybe it was life-threatening to others. Who's to say? But it was definitely wrong. Very wrong. So, I noticed that there was something in the chat. Is there...
Yes, so I was going to ask if you would have enough time to comment on it real quick.
Let's read it.
Alright. Nerd Safi. As important as therapy is when you have a problem, I think that preventative therapy is just as important.
Yes. Very much, I agree with that 100%. I mean, when you're training to become a therapist, one of the things that you are mandated to do is to participate in therapy, because you're very often going to be exposed to a myriad of problems. And some people have a hard time being able to be professional about some of those things, and sometimes they latch on and hold on to certain things that they're told in therapy and have big problems being able to relax and be able to understand that this is their problem, not their own, and they internalize it and it just becomes a huge issue. And so by getting therapy when you don't necessarily have a huge problem, it allows you to have a constructive way of understanding yourself and understanding how outside pressures affect you, and it creates a stronger internal you, which in my particular opinion means that when a harsh problem does impact you, you're better able to tackle it. I can speak from personal experience, and I will say this. About 4 years ago, my heart was ripped out of my chest in a relationship. And I had seen a therapist beforehand, and I think that because of the things that I experienced and the things I learned and the fact that I saw that therapist was the reason why I didn't jump off a bridge. Be 1,000%. Yeah, it's serious. Here's the thing: you get the real Justin. Everyone gets the real Justin. There ain't no I'm not ashamed about it. I mean, I was suicidal. I really was, and I can say that my knowledge when it came to psychology and my understanding of it helped. But I think that the fact that I saw a therapist beforehand and I knew immediately that I needed to see a therapist because of the way I was feeling, I was able to be strong enough with myself to be able to know it was time to get help and to seek it out. Had I not had a healthy relationship and had the ability to seek that type of help beforehand, I would never have been strong enough to know that I needed that, and I might have done something I would have regretted.
Okay. Well, I am glad you were here now.
Thank you.
Do you have time for one more comment?
Of course.
Okay. Kyle also comments, there's also the problem of what would happen if an employer sees you have something like a delusional disorder. What do you have to say about those types of instances?
I would say that it depends upon your workplace, but but Kyle is definitely touching on a particular thing. If you're going for a job that requires a national security or something that says, hey, we get to look into your personal background. So like if you're a cop, security guard, something in the military, maybe you have to operate heavy equipment like a truck driver or something like that. And they look into your background and they say, hey, you got all these sorts of issues, or maybe you have to take this pill. We can't have you doing that, so you're not qualified to do this. It can create a whole host of other problems. And so, yeah, definitely, it's a valid concern, to be honest with you. It's a valid concern. It's definitely something that other people have had to deal with and experience.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, this was a bunch of stuff that doesn't particularly make me happy to hear about. Granted, if I did, I'd be concerned myself. So let's leave this on a more positive or better note. What are some of the major benefits and reforms that have happened because of the research done? Because there's got to be quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so I guess we're going to start off with women. I would say that probably in the last 20 years or so, there has been a massive shift culturally when it comes to the way in which women are expressed and represented in the pop culture, in the world in general, everything else, right? And I think it has a lot to do with lots of elements of different things that are going on. But I think psychologically speaking, our ability to understand that, hey, this is how people think and they're not just objects, has really assisted and aided in our overall ability to process problems and have interpersonal relationships with opposite sex individuals. And because of this particular thing, I think that you see a lot of positive reforms happening, and it's really steeped in an understanding relating to this. You definitely see research being done that shows that a diverse group is typically a more productive group, and so it allows for more people to be involved in projects that would otherwise not be allowed. I would say one of the things that I've noticed that, and I have personally benefited from, has to do with the way education is conducted. When it comes to the way in which psychology is always evolving and adapting to things, the research out of very large fields, particularly when it comes to the treatment of people who have, let's say, a form of autism or something like. I was just going to use the autism as a thing because I don't want to go too complicated. Instead of being dismissed, they're able to be understood. I worked briefly with a clinic that helped treat people using ABA therapies, and I was able to actively see, oh, hey, these people are experiencing this particular kind of thing, and these kinds of actions are actually leading to positive outcomes, where instead of these people being kind of locked up, they're actually able to be productive members of society. I remember one person I was working with, they worked at McDonald's. I mean, they had a job. This is a person who was, pooping in a corner drooling, like a year before I met the person. And then by the time I was done, working at McDonald's. I mean, McDonald's is not a great job, but I mean, hey, go from that to being able to hold up a job, that's huge. I think there's a lot of other benefits that happen too, but I think that a lot of them are more like able to react to various things rather than being able to I guess it's more like less reactionary and more understanding when problems occur. And I think there's more of an open atmosphere because a lot of the treatments and things that have happened in the last 20 years or so that have opened the door to having conversations that may be uncomfortable, but are ultimately helpful and add to people's lives.
Get it. Well, I'm glad for that.
Yeah.
Didn't want it to be all like dark and dreary. Goodness.
I know you had a secondhand story.
It's a It's more of a negative story, and I really don't want to end up on that.
Okay, that's fair. How
You
about this?
know.
You can share your story, and I'll share a happy story.
We can do that. We can do that.
Okay.
It had to deal with the whole medication and how nonsense the insurance is. Ah. So, I had a family member of a friend who was going to get some medicine.
Mm-hmm.
They had to get just a pair of pills. Just two. Just a pair.
Mm-hmm.
The total for the darn thing, though, out of pocket, they already had to pay in the triple digits for just two individual pills.
Two pills.
Two pills. Just a pair.
And
it was already in the triple digits.
Do you know roughly triple digits how much? Was it like, we're talking like 160, or like we're talking like 400, or?
I know. It was a while ago. So, I knew for a fact it was above 150.
Stack and a half, man. Oh my god, it's a lot.
Because I think they were the type of people that I don't think that if it was any higher than 200, 300, I think they would have just ignored it and tried to find some other medicine, because I think that was a family that was really into home remedy stuff, but they went to the doctors that prescribed the medicine. And it was just, oh boy.
Yeah, that sounds like an honest to god mess. I feel bad for that person. Oh my gosh.
They had insurance, but like still out of pocket was still 150 minimum.
A lot of money for anyone to shell out. I hope that wasn't often. I mean, was that like every time, or is it just like one time deal?
They only mentioned it the one time. I don't know if it continued into a number of occurrences, because I could tell just from that one story alone they were already mad. I didn't want to, continue poking
you
that nest.
Poke the bear.
Yeah, I don't want to continue poking that bee's nest,
No. Okay. All right. Well, I'll share the happy little story.
Yay!
Okay. All right. While I was, let's say, I used to, well, not used to, actually, it is used to, technically speaking, for the time being. I used to go to a therapist, and I would be the person, and we would talk and everything like that, and it would handle, my issues. I always thought this was a good place to have, to conduct therapy, because they're very inclusive. And one of the times I went up there was a person who was from like a Hispanic background, right?
Okay.
And the parent didn't speak good English, but the kid did. And the parent kept on trying to say in Spanish to basically instruct the kid on what she was trying to convey to the person. Yeah. And the thing that I was really impressed by was the fact that while the person who was behind the desk didn't understand the parent, but also was having a hard time with the child, she contacted one of the people in the office who spoke Spanish and actually had the person come out, speak the exact thing, and find out that the kid was basically having some sort of issue, and was able to facilitate that need because they were able to understand the language, and then immediately that day got help. And I remember after seeing that kid, literally, I saw it every time I was leaving the office. I saw it, and it was like I was watching every day that went by. Like every week that went by, I saw that kid get progressively going from like mood and satty to like chalant, casual to happy.
Oh.
And so like it definitely was like a really awesome, heartwarming thing to see that like, hey, this particular organization cared so much about the people that they were able to facilitate that particular need, and also that there was a positive benefit from it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's everything.
Okay, well, I will say, if you guys want to hear more about any of these particular topics, please contact the show. Let us know what you liked. Even if you didn't like something, or you had something to share, feel free. We'd love to talk to you more about it. If not, then we're going to continue back to our normal content on Wednesday. And hopefully that this was an informative and helpful episode. I would just want to say thanks again for everybody who showed up and everybody who will watch the video in the future. If you like the content that we did, please subscribe. Please, share the channel. I plan to kind of have episodes like this periodically every 4 to 5 weeks. And so if you guys are really liking the content, then you'll have something to look forward to. The next 3 figures we're going to take a look at are Carl Rogers, Carl Jung, and Anna Freud. So, talked about the dad, now we're talking about the daughter.
Oh, thank you all so much for joining the live stream tonight, and we will see you on Wednesday. We bid you adieu.
Later, everybody.